European Union wants to bolster its defense in face of Russia's aggression on Ukraine and growing US demands for greater European financial support for NATO. On paper, the bloc has created its first ever defense industrial strategy, but will cost hundreds of billions of euros. Challenges for European rearmament are in focus this week on eu-decoded.
The Commission proposed a European defense industry program in March 2024. It provides for 1.5 billion euros to be allocated to defense from the EU budget between 2025 and 2027. The money should boost defense technology and industry, but is scanty when compared with the 500 billion euros of investment in the sector, which experts claim is needed in the coming decade.
Since Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, the EU has supplied much weaponry and logistical support. But the conflict highlighted difficulties in increasing ammunition and weapons production. We asked Europeans how they feel about spending to be ready for war.
I understand that sometimes you need a certain level of power and preparedness to show yourself strong for other diplomatic reasons, but still I think the world can function in much better ways rather than investing money in that.
I feel like it has to be well thought, and if the EU does decide to invest more money in war, I would like for this money to be used in an ethical and moral way.
Yeah, I think it have to stop to give money to Ukraine also. I think it's better to defend our countries now for the future, and I think it's better than to do that, yeah.
I would prefer not to spend money on it, but we are in a situation in Europe where we need to do it. Both our own protection, but we also need to protect Ukraine. If we don't protect Ukraine, we don't protect Europe.
Jacques Schicler covers this policy area for Euronews. The EU produces weapons, but is also highly dependent on imports. What are the main goals of the new strategy to boost the industry?
There's been a number of initiatives from the EU about this, regulations, standards and funding, all with a bid to ensure that that you can get the kind of economies of scale you get across the EU single market, so that countries, instead of each buying individually for their own armies and navies, that they club together and come up with some common principles and hopefully get the economies of scale you need to succeed.
The budget for this boost must be quite important. What are the financing options under discussion, and can the European Investment Bank also play a role?
Indeed, historically, most spending in this area has come from national budgets funding their national militaries. But there's certainly a lot of people around here who say maybe you could make it more efficient if you club together in some way at the EU level. You could have common borrowing of EU member states using Eurobonds, like was done in the response to the pandemic, or indeed you could have loans made via the European Investment Bank, which is backed by EU finance ministries. All of these face a number of problems. Firstly, there's not that much money available. All governments are pretty cash-strapped at the moment. And also, there are a number of bars on the EU spending money on defence. A number of its members are avowedly neutral, and there are legal restrictions on its ability, for example, to buy arms or ammunition.
Most of the EU members belong also to NATO, the main defense structure in the West. How does this affect the investment plans for the defense sector?
When you look at an industrial policy for defense, the risk is that you exclude other NATO members, such as the US or the UK. They won't be very happy if the EU passes a regulation that says all our military spending, it has to be spent on European companies. It can't be spent on British aerospace or US defence companies. So there's the risk that creates a rift within the NATO alliance.
More money will be also needed if the contribution target to NATO by each country increases from current 2% to around 3.5% of GDP, as advocated by the new Secretary General of the alliance. This could mean that the EU would need to raise as a whole around 200 billion euros per year. Currently, only Poland, Estonia, Latvia and Greece spend 3% or more. Germany and France, the bigger powerhouses in the EU, have reached the 2% target. But other big economies such as Italy and Spain are not yet at that level of spending.
With us at the European Parliament is Tobias Kramer, member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and the Subcommittee on Security and Defence. Welcome to Euronews. How feasible it is for the European Union to come together in the idea of increasing defence spending when some member states do not even respect the 2% target?
We have to understand that geopolitics is changing from a unipolar world order where we could rely on the United States providing security for everybody to a multipolar order where we need to also assume more responsibility to work together with the US, but that we need to strengthen especially the European pillar of NATO. A lot of countries already have achieved the 2%, but realistically we also need to spend more. But what is important to me is to say spending more, but also more efficiently.
NATO Secretary General just mentioned recently that instead of the 2% we might need to go as high as 3.5%. Germany, the country where you come from, is against the idea of issuing new common debt to get these large funds. But some countries argue that that is the only way to get a real boost to the industrial sector in the defense area.
I think Germany actually is one of the countries where you've seen the biggest shift when it comes to defense spending. We had the Zeitenwende, so the shift of era that Chancellor Scholz called out, and we then really invested the 100 billion special investment into the Bundeswehr, and we actually are saying we need to reform, for instance, the German debt brake in that direction so that we can actually spend the money we need to have a strong defense for our country and for Europe.
So the so-called Eurobonds for defense are feasible, are needed. Will we have a consensus among the member states when you know that the frugal countries are somehow more skeptical about that?
I think it's really important that every country meets at least 2% and that we then talk about how we can ensure that this is done, that also financing on the European level is done in a solidary way. And I think that different Eurobonds are one option, but I think there are also other things we can talk about. For instance, one problem is that there is a lot of private money that could actually be channeled in that direction. We talk about industry, when we talk about even the supply chain. And at the moment, there are a lot of barriers for private investors that can't invest even if they wanted to.
The EU is taking unprecedented steps to address the real potential of war. For the first time, it has a commissioner dedicated to the defense industry, the Lithuanian Andrius Kubilius. It also wants to use part of Russia's frozen assets for supporting Ukraine. But it remains to be seen to what extent it has the conditions and unity to be a global military power.